when you called me, I immediately said the '06 to 14 period, 2006 to 2014 was the best. Like my mind is wired that way. I think like most South Africans. But you did not think so because obviously you wanted to look at both men and women. But you took us back in your piece all the way back to the first win. Let's talk about that before we get to this one, eh?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
So I wanted to say, one of my favorite series because naturally, if you are in the good areas ecosystem, you're going to read a lot about from Jared, and because I read Overthrowing the Empire, and you wrote about it in great detail.
I will try and tell this story as quickly as possible. But essentially, what happens is an Englishman invents the wrong'un, and he plays a little bit of Test cricket, but he doesn't really do anything with this delivery. And then he teaches it to a friend, Reggie Swartz, who is an Englishman who's also South African. Reggie Swartz goes back to the was it West? Yeah, it must have been West of South Africa. Wait, am I getting that right? Yeah, Western districts. No, they're not called Western districts. What are they called?
No, it was Transvaal.
Was it Transvaal? Sorry, you're right. It was Transvaal. He goes back to Transvaal and he's like, "Hey guys, do you want to have a look at this ball that I've been bowling?" And he teaches it to three other batsmen. So these aren't even bowlers. They're just batters, right? And he gives it and he shows them this, and somehow they just all perfect it, like one after the other. And so South Africa are hosting England in 1905-06. England are sending over. It was probably one of the strongest sides that had gone to South Africa. They beat some really weak ones, but it was one of the stronger sides. But they just sent over like a decent side, nothing more. And they just got annihilated, right? And like I think one guy, Gordon White, ends up only taking like 2 wickets, but the rest of the leg spinners take a lot of wickets. It's a good South African side as well. I think it really took England by surprise how good it was. But this is a team that had never won a Test match before. I think they had one draw against Australia when Australia hopped off the boat. The boat was delayed, and so Australia got straight off the boat and had to play almost immediately and just struggled. That was all they'd had, and yet suddenly they win the first test with an incredible last wicket chase. And then they just annihilate England all the way through that series, and they end up winning 4-1. At that point, you could make an argument that they weren't even like I don't even think they were really considered like a test team, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
That victory, especially because of how brutal it was, basically cements them as the third test team, right? Because test matches only start getting officially recognised. I say officially, CS, it's not even official, but there was a guy in South Australia who said these are test matches in the late 1800s. And even some of the South African games, even we call them test matches now, but they weren't considered test matches at that time. So the fact that South Africa did this changes cricket forever, because that is the series that basically allows South Africa to form the ICC, and the South Africa then form the ICC so they can join the ICC. Right, so they can join the Australian and English club. If they hadn't have beaten England 4-1, I don't know if that would have happened. I'm not sure that they would have been seen as good enough. And they are not a good test team again until you start to see them get decent in the 50s. And then obviously in the 60s, they're fantastic. So it's not as if South African cricket just dominated. It's literally that one series, and outside of that, I think they had one really good win over England in 1935, where they won 1-0 in England. I think I've got that right, and that's about it. They really don't have long sustained success at that point.
That's kind of the South African story, isn't it? Because you touched on the getting stable in the 50s and then getting that 60s team that was gradually adding people. But then that 60s team was good for like what, 3 years before everyone was like, you know what, we don't want to play you guys anymore.
Yeah, it's actually 3 series as well. It's fascinating. I think it's oh wait, it's 4 years. It's 4 years. It's 65 to 69. So they play England in 65, and they play them in England. They beat them 1-0, and then they host Australia at home and they beat them 3-1, and then Australia comes back 3 years later or something, and they smash them 4-0, and that's it. The next Test series is against the West Indies in 1992. Right. So, and it, we won't get into the whole history of it, but obviously there was a lot going on in the world. And remember, South Africa had kind of banned themselves. No one ever mentions this, but South Africa weren't playing West Indies, India, or Pakistan. Well, if you're not playing half the test teams, you're almost banning yourself. That's why they weren't playing more test cricket in that period. And so because of that, we don't know how good that 66 or 65, 69 team was. We know they destroyed Australia in 2 straight series, but that was an Australian team that was struggling a little bit at times. Like, that was an Australian team that had been really, really good and maybe weren't quite at that level. The bowling attack of Australia, I think, was maybe a little bit weaker. Maybe that was the greatest side that they ever assembled, because you look at Barry Richards and Graham Pollock and Peter Pollock, Mike Proctor. Like, there are some clearly great players in this side, but there's also guys like Dennis Lindsay, who I think in one of the series against Australia went nuts, and he never in any other time in his life did he ever make any runs, right? So maybe there was a little bit of luck in that series, and the series against England, they only won it 1-0, so it wasn't like they were dominant in that series either. So I think it's fair to say that while that is a great series, and I'm sure a lot of old South Africans think about that quite highly, it is really 3 test series in 4 years, and they weren't really tested, and so we don't know how good that team would have been. Also, it's worth pointing out that the 2 series we've talked about so far, CS, Cricket South Africa does not claim as South African Test series because it happened before 1992, and so they don't even. Those aren't even the cricketers we talked about. Like Reggie Swartz and Mike Proctor are not actually officially South African cricketers, because they don't have a number and they are not recognised by Cricket South Africa, which is nonsense and a mistake. But that's a different thing for another day. But those are the 2 great moments they have before 1992.
Yeah, and look, as you're saying, like, CSA wants nothing to do with that. I get it a lot when I write something and then I go back and say this South African team did that, and someone comes to my DMs and says, dude, what are you talking about? This is not South Africa. And I'm like, well, the only other time after those 2 periods that we have a decent South African side, I think arguably one of the better South African sides actually is from 94 to 2000. They did well. They had 2 trophies, even though no one talks about those trophies a lot because they're like participation trophies in the modern day. But
it's weird. Let's just talk about the trophies, because I think that's fascinating to begin with. I think people had forgotten that cricket was in the Commonwealth Games until the women started playing it again, right? And when the women started playing it, everyone was like, oh, that's right, the men were in there. And it was played, I think it was on turf wickets. I'm pretty sure it was on turf wickets. At least some of the wickets were turf. But they played in whites in a one-day competition. The West Indies, who were probably still the second best team or third best team, maybe South Africa had taken over by that point, in the world, obviously had to be split up. So you didn't have the West Indies there. My memory of it was that South Africa was the only team that took it seriously. Like, not having a go at them, but just they really were like, here's a chance to win a Commonwealth gold medal. Whereas everyone else was like, okay, if we have to go, we go. So it was a really random thing that was there. And then you've got the Champions Trophy, which at that point wasn't even called the Champions Trophy, I don't think. I think it was called the ICC Knockout or some other name. And no one was taking that seriously either. It was very, very early on in the Champions Trophy. You could argue even now the Champions Trophy is not always taken seriously, but in the 90s, even less so. And then, and you pointed this out on the call as well, the team that they won the Champions Trophy with is about the least amount of stars you will ever see in a South African side. Like, it's a really random side. And so it's, again, not remembered. But those are still 2 trophies. For a country that doesn't win a lot of trophies, they won those trophies.
Yeah, look, they should be making noise about that. I don't know why they don't. Look, it's in the 90s. You wanted something to celebrate. Christmas. Do you know, here in South Africa, every year, I think things will change this year, but every year on Christmas Day, SuperSport plays the 438 game for the viewers' pleasure. So why not get old footage, show people winning titles? It's much better.
Do you know what?
Than nothing.
It is possible that the footage of the Commonwealth Games, they don't even own the rights to. Like, it's very possible if you think about it. The Champions Trophy one, they should be able to shoot. But I'm like, I don't think I've ever seen more than like 2 or 3 minutes of highlights from any of the Commonwealth Games, from the men's Commonwealth Games. So it is because there was an Australian who took a hat trick, I reckon, in the Commonwealth Games. And a few years ago, I think it might occasionally pop up on YouTube and then disappear because Commonwealth Games probably have good lawyers. But yeah, it might just be that. But your point stands of the 4-3-8 game is absolutely incredible. But South Africa did win 2 things. And as a test team, they start that period by drawing with Australia twice, right? So home and away, they have a 1-1 in Australia. They have a 1-1 away. They also are brilliant in test cricket over a long period of time. They dominate everyone that isn't Australia after that point. And then they were maybe the second or third, or maybe even the best team not to win a World Cup. They might be the best team to not make a final of a World Cup ever in '99.
Yeah, because this is why I say it was one of the best sides South Africa has ever produced, because when you look at the team sheet, you see all the big names. Well, some of them were still young, like Carlos and Boucher were still boys, but it was still very decent. And then the one everybody loves, the one I thought of first, the Graham Smith era. Took him about 3-4 years? 2006, they start beating everybody up. It's looking at the numbers. They didn't lose much.
Have you ever heard the story of how Graham Smith became captain?
I love that.
Yeah, because not everyone will know this. And I was telling someone this the other day, and I was like, it might have been Darren Goff. I don't think he had heard this story. It should be famous, this story. But essentially what happens is, Graham Smith was always very egotistical. I think he had, if I remember correctly, he had, I will be the future captain of South Africa on his fridge when he was a kid. Like, he was just that kind of dude, which is why he was so successful at such a young age, because he was so clear in what he wanted to do. And in 2003, he expects to be picked for the South African one-day side for the home World Cup. And he is not picked for that team. And so, hilariously enough, was it Transvaal again? Is it Transvaal? No, who is he playing for?
It's Western Province, but he's a Transvaal boy.
It was Western Province, you're right. It's probably, I don't know why, this whole podcast is just us talking about Western Province and Transvaal and me getting confused. He's playing for Western Province, and he's captaining Western Province in a warm-up game against South Africa. Now, this was at the early point where there weren't as many intra-club type things being played at that time, but obviously South Africa needed a warm-up game before the World Cup, and they had, I think it was 2 against the Western Province. And they were warming up out on the field and getting ready, and everyone was just mucking around, and Graham Smith went nuts. He said, "What are you guys doing? This is your chance to get in the South African team in the future. You play good here, and the selectors, the coaches, the senior players are all going to see it. This is your chance, right?" And then he gets out on the field, and he makes it very clear that he's taking this chance. And it was something to do with the fact that Sean Pollock wanted it to be like a warm-up game, and so the regulations to be a little bit like looser. And Graham Smith went nuts and just started screaming at him, apparently, and going, "No, we're playing this to World Cup regulations. What are you talking about? Whatever." There was sledging, there was abuse, whatever. And Western Province actually beat South Africa in that game. And that is essentially what leads to him taking over the side after Sean Pollock gets the flick at the 2003 World Cup. Am I misremembering that? But that's basically how it works, right?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, Sean Pollock just had to, how can I put it, capitulate to Graham Smith's might. And to his credit, Graham Smith did very well. He scripted one of the best runs, I think, from 10-11 to 13-14 without losing a series. A bunch of wins, a couple of goals.
They basically don't lose a series from 06 to 14, really, do they? They were the king of the draws. I'll give them, if there's a negative on their record, it's just that there were a lot of draws. But they didn't lose away from home, right? Like, it is a ridiculous record, and they played some great cricket in that time. And I think when I looked it up, and this is a couple of years ago, and maybe India might have pushed them out, but I had them as the 5th ranked test team of all time. When I went through that period, I thought they were good enough to be in that top 5 that we had ever seen. The issue that we have is that firstly, they didn't do anything in white ball cricket in that period. They really, really struggled as a men's white ball, and their women fall apart. So in 94 to 2000, the women make a semi-final of the World Cup. Right, it's a one-off and it comes from nowhere and it doesn't really get repeated, but they do make it. Whereas from 06 to 14, even when they were getting better in women's cricket, they weren't even in the conversation, right? And so in white ball cricket and women's cricket, they are terrible. So if we say that's their greatest ever era, it's all based on just that test team, which were, as I said, maybe one of the best ever, but they really disappointed in women's cricket and white ball cricket.